Hey everybody, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our Bible study in John chapter 2 tonight. Free ebook down in the description below if you want to get a hold of that. What is the Bible? And all the free notes that I'm reading off of are available down in the link there as well on our website, 2BeLikeChrist.com. Let's get into this. This is probably going to be a little bit of a shorter chapter. I have 15 pages of notes, but I got a bunch of pictures in there. There's only 25 verses in this chapter, so let's get right into it. Verses 1 and 2. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. You remember that Jesus has just called Nathanael and Philip, and he's had his first encounter with Peter and Andrew in the last chapter. Now it says the third day. This is probably talking about the third day after encountering Philip and Nathanael. There's this wedding that's going on in Cana, and Cana is a little bit to the west of the Sea of Galilee. You see it there on your map that you have in the notes. Jesus would spend most of his time up around the northern side of the Sea of Galilee, so he's over a little bit west of where he usually is or where he usually will be. We aren't told exactly who was getting married. There's a lot of suspicion that maybe it was, some people think it was John, the author of this book, think it was his wedding, but there's really not any way to prove one way or another whose wedding it was. It does seem that it's possible that maybe it was one of Jesus's relatives, and we'll see why. There's some reason to believe that in the notes to follow. Just a side note here, it says that Mary was there, his mother, but it doesn't say anything about Joseph. And Joseph is never mentioned after Jesus's early years, and a lot of people think that he may have died sometime in Jesus's upbringing, because he's never mentioned, and certainly Joseph doesn't seem like to have the kind of character of a man who was going to run away. If he was going to run away, he probably would have run away before Jesus was ever born. So a lot of people think that he may have been dead at this point. I have a few pictures in there just for your enjoyment about some of the ways that this has been portrayed in art over time. I got a 14th century one and then a 16th century image there. And this is one of the more popular illustrations that you'll find. But let's read verse 3. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." So we kind of skip here through most of the wedding feast, and we're probably towards the end here, because what's happened is they've run out of wine, run out of stuff to drink. And in our culture, this isn't as relatable. In our culture, weddings typically last maybe a half a day to a day at the most. But in the ancient Jewish customs, they would last multiple days sometimes. And something apparently had gone wrong in the planning here, and the hosts had run out of wine. And just like in a modern wedding, it'd probably be pretty embarrassing if you ran out of like food or drink for your wedding guests. Now it's a little bit easier for us to remedy that, because you can run down to the store really quick, or there's catering services that can make things happen for you pretty quick. But that wasn't the case here, and it wasn't like you could just run and grab some lemonade or iced tea at the store and fix the problem. And Jesus's mother approaches Jesus about this dilemma. She comes to him and says, "They have no wine." And this is why some people suspect that this may have been one of Mary's family members who's getting married, because she's privy to this information that I'm sure they weren't making publicly known at this time, but she knows that they've run out of wine, and then she comes to Jesus in hopes that he's going to be able to remedy this problem. And we see in the next few verses that Mary's statement, "they have no wine," is more than just a statement of fact, and Jesus understood that she was coming to him because she wanted him to fix the problem. So let's read verses 4 and 5 and see the way that Jesus and his mother interact. And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." And his mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." This is a bit of a tricky passage, I think. At least it leaves you with some questions at first. I think if we dig into it a little bit, we'll be able to answer those questions. But Jesus responds to his mother. He says, "Woman, what have I to do with thee?" That's the King James. In the English Standard, he says, "What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." just a side cultural note here. If I was to call my mother woman, it would be highly disrespectful, right? But here and in other passages, we find that this term was used commonly. It was not a sign of disrespect to call your mother woman. But so I wouldn't advise you trying that in today's world, but probably would add some issues, no issues here in this time zone. No, not time zone. Time area. What era? There we go. In this era, didn't give any issues. Jesus says, these next two sentences I think are difficult. Jesus says here, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. So Mary says, they don't have any wine. Jesus looks back at her. He says, what does this have to do with me? My hour hasn't come yet. Well, we're trying to get to the bottom of two things. What does Jesus mean when he says this doesn't have anything to do with me? And then what does he mean when he says that my hour hasn't come yet? That's a phrase that we'll encounter throughout the Gospels and have even seen a little bit in Matthew and Mark. But what does Jesus mean when he says, what does this have to do with me? This is the way that I understand the verse. I kind of paraphrased this. So I understand Jesus to be saying, the hosts have run out of wine. What concern is that to me? I've not come to the earth to provide people with wine. Divine power is not for resolving simple domestic matters. I came down from heaven for a greater hour than this one. And that hour, referring to his sacrifice on the cross, in being the Lamb of God and the salvation of the world, and that hour has not yet come. And so I understand Jesus to be saying that this is not why he is on the earth. He's making a statement of clarification. Jesus' mother is concerned with this earthly dilemma, but Jesus wanted it to be clarified that he had come to fix bigger problems. I think that's what he's getting at here. What does this small issue have to do with me? The Savior has not come down here to fix problems that people have at their weddings because something went wrong in the planning process, right? That's not why I'm here. This is not my hour. Hopefully that makes some sense. But so he wants it to be clarified that he's here for something bigger. That being said, Jesus' clarification was just that. It was a clarification. It was not a refusal to act and to assist his mother with the problem at hand. Because when we read this, it seems really strange that Jesus says, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And then Mary turns around in the very next sentence, seemingly, and says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to do. Like, what she took away from that was that he was going to help her. The language doesn't make that immediately clear, I guess. It can be a little bit confusing, but that seems to be what is going on. Jesus is making a clarification, but he's not refusing to act and to assist his mother. And Mary, knowing her son, as mothers do, understood this to be his intention. We don't know if there's a little bit more dialogue that happened here that we're not privy to. We don't know the way that Jesus said this, the inflection in his voice. But, as mothers know their sons or their children in general, they can tell by the way that somebody says something what their intentions are, even if other people can't. Here, we don't know exactly how Jesus said this, but evidently Mary did, and she knew that Jesus wasn't refusing her. So she seems to have taken Jesus' point while understanding that he was still willing to help her. And this prompted her then to tell the servants to do whatever Jesus tells them to do. Okay, verse 6. I'd be interested too if anyone's ever heard any other interpretations of that or any other ways to look at that and make sense of it. But that's the best that I've got for you for now. Verse 6. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. There's some jars made out of stone there, and these were probably pretty commonplace in Jewish households. In our Matthew and Mark study, we looked at how the Jews used these purifying waters for purification ceremonies, and they also practiced an adherence to this ritualistic hand washing that was a tradition of the Pharisees. And so they had to have certain water in their homes to be able to do that. And the Old Testament had rules about certain types of vessels, what they could be made of, and things like that. So this was probably very common to have jars like this in your house. And this says that the jars held about 20 to 30 gallons of water. The King James uses the measurement of firkins, which is not something that we are probably familiar with. ESV goes ahead and translates it 20 to 30 gallons. And there seems to be still some debate about exactly what measurement this was, but apparently the translators of the ESV have settled on this, and that's what I'm going to go with for the time being until I'm educated otherwise. But I tried to look up a 20 to 30 gallon bucket or container, and I couldn't find any real good pictures, but I was able to find a picture of a 55 gallon drum. I used to order these all the time for work when I worked in a car manufacturing facility back home. But a 55 gallon drum, you probably know what that looks like, and there is a picture there. So Jesus would have made approximately 3 of these drums if this measurement is accurate, which, about 150 to 180. Yeah, 150 to 180 gallons, which is quite a bit of. That should get people through the rest of the feast, I would hope. Okay, verses 7 through 9. Jesus said to his servants, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." So they took it. And when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom. It's easy to skip over verse 7 and where the servants fill up the containers to the brim, but probably not so easy to skip over if you were those servants who had to draw 150 gallons of water out of the well and then transport it to fill up all of these containers. But when the jars had been filled to the brim, Jesus told the servants to draw some of the water out and take it to the master of the feast. King James says the governor of the feast. This is probably not all together dissimilar from like a wedding planner today. Someone who's kind of in charge, the master of the ceremonies, someone in charge of all of the timing of things, the entertainment, just getting the food, getting everything organized. It's not clear exactly if the water had been transformed into wine before the servants drew it out, or if it was transformed into wine somewhere between the servants drawing it and the master of the feast taking or drinking it. Just not told, but at some point this happened. And when the master of the feast tasted the wine, he was shocked because apparently it was delicious. And he calls the groom to him and he asks him why he saved the best wine for last. And that might seem like a strange question. Maybe not for modern day, but why would he ask a question like that? Well, when you first taste something, it really goes for anything. Any food, any drink, when you first taste it, you taste all the flavors, right? And it comes alive and your taste buds are excited by whatever it is that you're tasting. And so the first couple drinks or the first couple bites of that thing, you're really enjoying the taste. But what happens after you've eaten or drunk 5 different glasses of whatever the beverage that is, or you've eaten 2 platefuls of whatever food that is? Well, your taste buds kind of start to dull, right? The flavor is not quite as potent at the end as it was at the beginning. And I think that's why those dainty restaurants always serve like small portions of things. But there was a food, my mother always used to make dirt cake, and I've never experienced this phenomenon more than when I ate dirt cake. There's something about dirt cake that when you eat the first couple bites, it's like the best thing in the world. But then for some reason the taste starts to significantly dull, and when you're on like your 20th bite, it's not nearly as good. It's still good, don't get me wrong. I still eat the whole container, but it's not nearly as the flavors are not nearly as robust maybe as the first bite. But I'm sure you have a food that you'd probably love where you can say a similar thing. But that's why generally at a wedding feast, the best wine was served first to impress the scrutinizing palates of the newly arrived guests. And the not so good wine was served towards the end when people's taste buds were less sensitive. And so here in creating such good wine, Jesus was he was reversing the shame that this family was really scared that they were going to have to endure for running out of wine. He turned that into honor. And now, they're perceived as super special because they saved all the good wine until last. So Jesus does them an honor here. Verse 11 through 12. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. This is the first miracle that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee. And now, was this the first miracle that Jesus ever did? My suspicion is no, because Mary comes to Jesus and she assumes that he can do something about their problem. Mary doesn't suspect that Jesus has a secret vineyard somewhere where he's hiding 150 gallons of wine. I think she expects that he's going to be able to do something miraculous. Right? So how much Mary knew and when she knew it and what power Jesus had displayed before his public ministry, we're not exactly sure, but probably not, I would suspect at least, the first miracle that was ever performed. But it says that it was the first miracle that was performed in Cana of Galilee. It says it manifested, or it made known his glory, his praiseworthiness, his deity. And this miracle was said to create faith in his disciples, and they believed on him because of it. Following the feast, then, the wedding feast, Jesus, his mother, his brothers, and his disciples went to Capernaum for a few days. And Capernaum is up towards the north of the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus would spend a lot of his time, but just to the northwest of Cana. Verse 13. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. The Passover celebration, we've talked about it some length in our other studies, but it was a memorial, it was a celebration of God's deliverance of the Jews from Egyptian slavery 1,500 or so years before Jesus was actually born. So this was an old tradition that the Jews kept every year. And every year in the springtime, late March, early April, many of the Jews traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast. And Jesus here is going from Capernaum down to, or the Galilee area at least, down to Jerusalem. I have a note there, a map there in your notes. It shows what this journey would have been like. And you're looking at probably about 80 miles, or roughly, to make this journey. So this was not just like, some day trip that they took. This was a big commitment to go down to Jerusalem. But this was a way that seemed, a path that seemed well trodden down because of the Jewish population in Jerusalem, the Jewish population in Galilee. There's probably many, many of them who traveled together to come to the feasts. I also have a picture there in your notes of the temple complex, at least a model of the actual temple complex in Jerusalem. And that's important for what we're about to read about next. Verse 14 through 16 now. What's Jesus going to do when he gets to Jerusalem? This is what he's going to do. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Jesus is not coming into Jerusalem subtly at the beginning of his ministry here. He certainly is coming in with a bang. He is coming over, flipping over tables in the temple, making a whip and running people out of the temple, the money changers and merchants. And we'll talk about that in a second, but why? I guess. Why does Jesus do this? Why is he so angry about this? Weren't these people offering services that were, people needed? Uh, is this a little overboard? What's going on here? I included a section of notes that I believe was in our Matthew 21 notes, and it's already there. I've discussed it there, and I don't want to go over all of this in total detail just for the amount of time that it will take, especially having already covered it. But I want to talk about just a little bit about what was going on at the temple and why Jesus is so angry. And you'll see that it's not an overreaction. The temple had been turned, unfortunately, into a money-making business by a lot of the Jewish elite. And there were several ways that the Jewish leaders made money from the temple. The first one was the temple tax. Every year, just about every Jewish man was required to give a half shekel for the upkeep of the temple, and this is called the temple tax. At least that's what I'm going to call it. And doing some quick estimations of the numbers that were brought in through this temple tax, it's probably in the millions, probably in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars was being brought in. If you think in this time period, if there were 3 million Jews and they were all paying a half shekel, and this was not just being collected in Jerusalem, but secular history tells us that they collected this throughout the world. Whether you came to Jerusalem or not, the people in the temple were going to get your temple tax. And so this was being collected by millions of Jews, and they're all giving this money, and probably a massive sum of money. There was even a Roman general who said that the Jews in the temple had become richer than Rome itself. Probably some exaggeration there, but just driving home the point of how much money they were collecting, right? So huge amounts of money. Now, is that necessarily a problem? No, that's not necessarily a problem. In fact, there was even some laws about that in the Old Testament. But here's a problem. And that was that another way that they made money was through money changers. There was only a specific type of currency used in the temple, and that was by design of the Jewish leaders. That was not, as far as I know, by God's design. So there were people who were standing ready to exchange money when you arrived at the temple to pay your taxes. And the way that Jesus responds to these money changers, it's not as if they were just being kind and doing the people a nice service, but there was probably some extortion going on here and people being ripped off by terrible exchange rates. If you've ever tried to change your money in the airport, you may have met some people like that before. But people would come, they were using what was called a Tyrian shekel, a piece of money from Tyre, which was not very common. So most people would have had to have their money changed, and they were probably doing it at rates that were ridiculous, and they were that were hard on the people who were coming to change money. There was also this third way, animal sales. If you are familiar with the Old Testament, you'll know that there were sacrifices people had to make when they came to the temple, and they had to offer animals. But you also know that those animals couldn't be blemished. They couldn't be injured or have wounds or something on them. And it was the priest who would inspect to make sure that the animals were up to par. Well, you can imagine if you're coming even from Galilee, where Jesus was coming from, 80 miles, and you've got to haul a sheep or an ox 80 miles. That's a long way. And guess what? There's a good chance that your animal could be injured if you're hauling it that far. And so it's probably a lot more convenient for you to just buy an animal in Jerusalem instead of taking your own from your house. And so here we have people who are selling animals, but again, we probably have some high prices being charged for these animals. And you can imagine the priest who inspected the animals, if somebody had brought an animal from home, the priests who wanted to make money off of the animal sales in the temple, they could have just looked at that animal and said, oh, look, your animal, it's sick, so we can't use this animal. Now you have to go over here and buy our animal at a price that's, twice as much as you would actually pay. Guess who's getting the profits from that? the people who are in charge of the temple. So this is why Jesus is so angry. You can see them almost like triple dipping here. They have the temple tax. They're making a ton of money that way. Then they're changing money at high rates. So they're making money that way. Then they're selling animals at high prices probably and making money that way. And so the people are supposed to be coming to Jerusalem to celebrate what God has done for them and for this to be a joyous occasion and a memorial. And you can imagine that many people probably would have dreaded coming to Jerusalem because it had become a financial burden to do so. And God's design was never for religion to be a financial burden. He had made provisions in the Old Testament law, even different sacrifices that could be offered for poor people. And now here, the priests have looked at this as a business opportunity and now are basically ripping off their own people who are just trying to come and honor God. So you can see why Jesus would be so mad that this is occurring. So no, he was not overreacting. So in light of all this, Jesus was enraged. He creates a whip of cords and he drives out the salesmen, probably the animals too, out of the temple, and he flipped the tables of the money changers. And he makes his motives known to those who are selling pigeons. He says, "Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." I think people in every age, in every generation, have had a temptation to turn worship into a money-making opportunity. People who see business opportunities where they really shouldn't be exploited. I don't want to use that word. Well, yeah. There may be opportunities to make money, but sometimes those are better left out when it comes to religion, especially if you're going to be hindering someone from doing what's right because you're trying to make money off of them. I think you understand what I mean. And we talked about how people probably dreaded coming to Jerusalem and having to pay all this money just to worship God and to obey the law and to be good Jews. And so Jesus is really angry that they're more interested in profit than they are in pure worship. Verse 17. His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." This quotation comes from Psalm 69, verse 9, where it reads, "For zeal for your house has consumed me. The reproaches of those who reproached you have fallen on me." Zeal, you can define it as great energy or enthusiasm in pursuit of a cause or an objective. So here we have Jesus showing great enthusiasm for pure, honest worship of God, and his pursuit of that objective animates him here to create this whip and to drive out the corruption that he sees. His zeal leads him into this action, and watching him, his disciples remember a verse that they'd probably heard, that they had heard, from the Psalms in Psalm 69, verse 9. The Jewish leaders then confronted Jesus, asking him what evidence he could provide them to show them that he had authority to act this way in their temple. They're basically saying, "Who do you think you are that you're going to come in here and tell us that we are wrong? We are the experts. We're the priests of the Old Testament law. Who are you?" Jesus doesn't give them an immediate sign. He knew that they weren't really interested in legitimate signs of authority. If they were, they could have looked back at the Old Testament law that they said that they knew so well and had seen, by its authority, seen that they were wrong and that they needed to change. Jesus wouldn't provide them with an immediate sign, but he would provide them with a sign in the future that would signify that his actions in the temple were legitimate and that they were a legitimate display of God's displeasure with their greed. Excuse me. Jesus would be shown to have the approval of God when God raised him from the dead 3 days after his crucifixion. And Jesus tells the Jews that this is going to be the case, but he uses kind of veiled language here. He says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up," in verse 19. The Jews, who didn't have any interest in discovering the truth behind Jesus' words, they immediately mock this idea, assuming that he was talking about the temple in Jerusalem, the physical structure. And the temple had been under construction for decades, thanks to Herod and his commitment to renovate it to win some favor with the Jews. And so they said, they've been building this temple, they've been renovating this temple for 46 years. You say you're going to tear it down and build it up in 3 days? That's ludicrous. It's nonsense. So they dismiss what he said. But the point of confusion is that they don't understand what temple Jesus is referring to. As we mentioned in chapter 1, the Jews had long reverenced the physical temple as the dwelling place of God on earth. But as we also mentioned in chapter 1, Jesus is God come to the earth, and Jesus' body now contains that presence of God. And this is why Jesus refers to himself as the temple. He is where God dwells. Now, the Jews didn't give this the time of day to actually think it through, or even pause to be slow to pass judgment on it, but that's what Jesus is talking about. He is the temple of God. God's presence is him. And God's temple, his body, would be destroyed, killed on the cross, but it would be resurrected. It would be rebuilt in 3 days. And so that's what he's getting at with this picture of the temple. If the Jews wanted to know God, they needed to turn their attention away from the physical structure and point their eyes towards Christ. They thought it was ridiculous to suggest that a temple like that could be rebuilt in 3 days, and they acted like it was the most ridiculous thing that they had ever heard. But Jesus was telling them that he was going to accomplish something that was actually significantly greater than rebuilding a physical temple in 3 days. You see, structures like the temple had been built with the power of human hands before. But no human had ever possessed the power to raise the dead. Only God possessed that power. So which would be more miraculous? A temple being built in 3 days, or a body being resurrected in 3 days? Given enough time, a human being could build a temple. Given enough time, given 3 days, given 1,000 years, given 10,000 years, no one was ever going to be able to resurrect a dead person. And so Jesus, in saying that his body is going to be resurrected, rebuilt in a way, is making a greater claim than even rebuilding the physical temple in 3 days. Jesus' disciples, you notice, this will become clear, especially as we go throughout the gospel, is that they didn't understand this either. They didn't have their head completely wrapped around what Jesus was saying. But they didn't jump to a condemnation of Jesus just because of their lack of understanding. When they finally got their heads wrapped around this 3 years later, after Jesus had resurrected, as it says in verse 22, then they realized that Jesus had been right, that what he said had come true, and that they were in a much better position than the Pharisees, who had written Jesus off years ago and basically said that he was a guy who walked around speaking nonsense. And I thought that there was a good application in this for us. That's that just because something doesn't make sense to us the first time that we hear it doesn't make it nonsense. The Jewish leaders immediately dismissed Jesus and his words as nonsense. The apostles, though, didn't, and they withheld their judgment. And as we mentioned, it took 3 years for them to realize that Jesus' words were true. They were willing to withhold judgment, to investigate, to continue to listen to Jesus, to be slow to speak, like James chapter 1, verse 19 tells us. And eventually, they realized that just because they didn't understand up front didn't mean it wasn't true, because what Jesus said came to be just as he said. They just needed to have a better understanding. And so for application, are we humble enough to admit when we may not be smart enough or have enough facts to pass immediate judgment on everything that we hear? Are we patient enough to wait for the truth? Let me read that one more time. Are we humble enough to admit we may not be smart enough or have enough facts to pass immediate judgment on everything we hear? Are we patient enough to wait for the truth? I think this is especially relevant in our culture with this social media nonsense where the media blows up a story and people don't wait for the truth. They get all outraged about it immediately. And there's never any like delaying and saying, maybe I don't have all the facts here. Maybe I could wait on this before I pass judgment on this. We love to be quick to jump to judgment. And part of the reason for that, I think, is because when a certain thing, something is trending, by us getting our opinion out there the fastest, a lot of times it gets more recognition. When people are hot on an issue, if you put out a piece, your opinion on something, it typically, I mean, if the issue is trending, then you're probably going to get more traffic to whatever it is that you are saying. People know that. I know that, even especially as a YouTuber, and always feeling the pull to jump out at some current event and throw it up here because I know it'll get more views. But that's true not only in that side of things, but there's also what about in religious issues, where sometimes when somebody comes and presents something to us, maybe it's on a doctrinal position, maybe it's on something about religion. A lot of times, if we don't understand it, if it's not what we already agree with, we just dismiss it. Like, no, that's not what I know. That's not what I've heard. That's not what I understand. And so whatever you're saying must be nonsense. I've had people do that to me before, and I've probably done it to people before. But are we humble enough to say, let me investigate this? I don't have the answer to whether you're right or wrong at this moment, but let me dig into this a little bit more, gather some facts, take some time to think it over, and I'll come back and I'll consider this, or we can discuss this or whatever. Our pride keeps us from doing that a lot of times. And the apostles here could have let their pride be like the Pharisees and just dismiss Jesus. This guy's crazy. We're not following him anymore. But they didn't. And they were patient. And eventually, even though it took 3 years, their patience and their slowness to judge paid off. So I think I've beat that point down enough. Okay. Side note here. Important side note here. You might be asking, if you're a sharp Bible student, wait a second. I thought Jesus cleansed the temple at the end of his ministry, the last week of his death. Isn't that what we studied in Matthew and Mark when we went through those books? Matthew chapter 21, Luke chapter 11, Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 19 all record a very similar account to this that happened in the last week of Jesus' life, also during the Passover. So the question is, what's going on here? Because this is the very beginning. Here we find Jesus cleansing the temple during the Passover, and this is taking place at the beginning of his ministry. So some people suggest that this is a contradiction, that the gospel writers got their stories mixed up. They don't actually know when this happened, and John ends up flubbing it, or the other three end up flubbing it, and they get everything out of whack. And look, the gospel writers don't know what they're talking about. Upon closer inspection, we can find that these accounts are not contradictory, but they're actually describing separate events. So let's consider that just for a moment. Something to consider here is that just because the stories are similar doesn't mean that they are the exact same occurrence. Why would we say that? Well, common sense is one point, but think back with me to the Old Testament. Is there ever anything that's repeated or very similar throughout the Old Testament, but doesn't necessarily describe the same events? And the answer is yes, there's definitely stuff like that. If you've read the Old Testament prophets, then you'll find God saying very similar things to people in different generations. And this was because the Jews continuously struggled with the same sins, and they needed continuous correction. Jesus, in his ministry, continuously corrected the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes over very similar issues because they were stubborn. And apparently those in the temple needed the same kind of continuous correction. Jesus cleansed the temple at the beginning of his ministry, as we're talking about here, John chapter 2, and then he had to teach that lesson again towards the end of his ministry and his time on earth in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Repeating the action that he took at the beginning of his ministry at the end of his ministry would have driven home the point that the Jewish leaders had failed to learn anything after they had listened to years and years of Jesus's preaching, right? God would often come back to his people in the Old Testament to drive home the point that he had warned them that if they didn't change, that punishment was going to come on them. Well, here I think we have a picture of Jesus comes to them in the beginning, he gives them a warning, and then he comes back at the end of his ministry and he repeats the same process. Why? Because they haven't learned anything, and they need to, this condemnation of their actions needs to be repeated because they are not getting the message. And any of the priests who would have been there at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and now saw this again would have had this point driven home to them twice. And if they had tried to act like, oh, we're innocent and we've tried to do what's right, this would be a clear statement of, no, you haven't. Let's see. Oh, and to say that doing something twice was inconsistent with God and the way that he treated the Jews in the Old Testament, like that just wouldn't be right. The precedent is, and the track record of the Jews is that things often had to be repeated because of their hard-headed track record. So it actually makes a lot of sense for Jesus to cleanse the temple twice, to reiterate their unwillingness to repent. There are also differences in these accounts. That's not the only evidence that there's two accounts here. There's differences between John 2 and then the other three accounts that seem to speak of this as at the end of his ministry. So here's a few. In John 2, Jesus makes a whip of cords to cleanse the temple. There's no mention of that in Luke, Matthew, Mark. In John 2, Jesus tells the merchants, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His words are different in the other three Gospels. In the other three Gospels, he says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer," but you make it a den of robbers. That den of robbers language and the house of prayer language isn't present in John. And then another, in John 2, the Jewish officials immediately confront Jesus after he cleanses the temple, and he responds to them with a statement about destroying the temple and he'll rebuild it in 3 days. That is not the same way that the events play out in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Gospels. So there's a few reasons there as to why I believe that these are two separate events. These facts suggest two separate events, two cleansings of the temple during the ministry of Jesus, one in the beginning and one in the end. So that's where we will leave that. Let's talk about verses 23 and 25 and close out the chapter. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about him, for he himself knew what was in man. So John doesn't make it too easy on us as he closes out the second chapter. These verses I find to be a little bit hard, and it seems like a lot of commentators have a little bit of difficulty with interpreting this. The language is just kind of tough. Verse 23 is easy, though. Let's talk about that one. It's interesting that Jesus is willing to do signs for people if those people are willing to believe. But for people who are stubborn, he's not going to do miracles just so that they can turn around and reject him and not even take into account the supernatural thing that just went on in front of their face. But for people who had more open hearts, he was willing to do signs and miracles, and many people, quote, believed in him during this Passover feast. Now, for verse 24 and 25, let's read those again. But Jesus, on his part, did not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. Now, I'm going to give an interpretation of this, and I'll just say I'm not dogmatic in any way about this. If anyone's ever heard a different interpretation, I'd be really interested in hearing it, because I'm just not like totally sold on this one that I'm about to present, but it's the best one that I can think of. I don't think there's any, contradiction in what I'm about to present, but you know that feeling when you read something and it's like, okay, but like it doesn't, like, it's not like the puzzle piece falls into place perfectly. That's kind of how I feel on this, but we're going to give it a shot. Verse 24 and 25 seem to modify the belief of the people in verse 23. So it says that they believed, but I think this is almost to put that belief in quotations, that they believed on Jesus. The people accepted Jesus willingly when they saw the miracles, but the rest of the Gospels reveal that that faith was kind of shallow. A great number of these, quote, believers turned away from Christ when he began teaching difficult things, or when he didn't meet the expectations that they had about who the Messiah was supposed to be in their minds. Their belief was very shallow. Jesus, knowing the fragility of their belief, did not entrust himself to them. Okay, so Jesus, knowing that yes, while they, quote, believed in him, he did not entrust himself to them. Now, that's kind of a tough word. What does that mean, that Jesus didn't entrust himself to them? The word translated entrust in verse 24 is actually the same word that's translated believed in verse 23, which is interesting. And I put the Strong's reference there. I'll read that. To have faith. This is what this word can mean. To have faith in, upon, or with respect to a person or a thing. That is, to credit, by implication, to entrust, especially one's spiritual well-being, to Christ. To believe, to commit, to trust, to put trust with somebody. Okay, so that's what it's the same term that's used in John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes or trusts in him should not perish but have eternal life. That's the word. We are supposed to entrust ourselves to Christ, and we do as Christians because we know that he is a solid foundation. He's trustworthy, right? But verse 24 seems to be suggesting that Jesus did the opposite with these people. He was unwilling to put his trust in the strength of these people's commitment. We might say that he wasn't banking on their faith, right? He didn't put stock in their faith. Why? Well, because he knew what people were like. He had created everything, including all human beings, and he was aware of human beings' fickle nature. And he would have known not only the nature of this collective group of people, but the individuals within that group and the specifics about their faith. And he knew that many of these people were going to walk away from him later on in his ministry. And so he does not entrust himself to them. I tried. I don't know if that helped or just confused you more, but maybe it brings you some clarity, or maybe it'll spur your mind on to come up with a better interpretation. I'm going to continue to study that, and maybe if I find a different interpretation, I'll present it in one of the upcoming chapters. But that's a tough wording there. And so I will, as the apostles, reserve judgment and be humble enough to admit that maybe I just haven't found the answer yet. Anyway, it's time to go. Time to go. We've been here 50 minutes or so. So thanks everybody for watching. Sorry about my ramblings tonight. Hopefully chapter 3 will be a little bit more concise. But I hope that this has at least been helpful in some ways to you. Remember, subscribe, share the videos, grab the notes online, grab the ebook online. The Matthew notes are soon to come out. I've got to do some design work now that I've gotten the approval from Crossway to use the text of their ESV. And so that will be available soon. Thank you, everybody, for your attention and your patience. And I'll see you guys next time.